After the Khalil Mack trade, the Raiders had a ton of draft picks, and if they were just decent at those draft picks, they would have an amazing roster right now. Not to say that the roster is bad, but I mean, it could be like Super Bowl caliber if they just were decent at drafting. Because listen, everyone can go back after the fact and say, oh, well, if they drafted this guy instead of that guy, then they would have been better. Of course. In hindsight, Tom Brady shouldn't have gone in the 6th round. I mean, yeah, you can play that game all day. But I wanted to do something a little bit more fair. What I'm simply going to do here is look at the consensus big board ranking of mock drafts leading up to the draft and simply just pick the player that the media, the consensus that the media was on, would have highest on their board. So here's how it's going to work. So you see, Clelin Ferrell was the 4th overall pick in the 2019 draft, but Josh Allen was still on the board at that time, and he was the highest rated player on the consensus big board still available. So now, instead of drafting Clelin Ferrell, which was a weird pick at the time, even then, they now get Josh Allen, who would be a pretty significant upgrade. Then with pick 24, this is kind of the one that I would say, you could argue either way. I think like Josh Jacobs, a good running back. Again, running back doesn't have a ton of value. Getting a better tackle would obviously have more value, I would say. But it's not like Jawan Taylor has like knocked it out of the park in his own right. So you could certainly make I think he's fine. He's an okay tackle. So this is one I think you could certainly make the argument for, especially what the Raiders were trying to do. Jacobs would have been more valuable to that team. So for Mike Mayock, who a big part of his philosophy was if you like a player, don't worry about when you're drafting him, just draft the player you like. In this scenario, it might have actually been a good thing for them. Then later in the same draft, they got Jonathan Abram, who they could have had DK Metcalf. He was the next guy on the board. So again, a draft of getting Josh Allen and DK Metcalf in the 1st round, along with Jawan Taylor, who can still play, feels a lot better than Jonathan Abram, Clelin Ferrell, and Josh Jacobs. The following year, they would draft Henry Ruggs, who was decent when he was on the field. Like, I don't really think it's fair to blame the Raiders too much for that Henry Ruggs pick. Kind of one of those where it didn't work out for other reasons, kind of beyond your control. But there's no denying that Tristan Wirfs would have been the better selection there, even if Henry Ruggs didn't have his, off the field concerns, to put it lightly. Tristan Wirfs has been an awesome tackle for them for the Buccaneers, and having Wirfs and Colton Miller on each side would be fantastic. You could put Taylor on the inside perhaps, and now your offensive line's actually looking pretty good, and you've added DK Metcalf to the mix here. Not to mention, with their next pick, Justin Jefferson was available. They drafted Damon Arnett instead. So you could have Justin Jefferson, and you could then have DK Metcalf, and maybe you still go out and trade for Devontae Adams. That's like the best receiving core of all time, along with a much more improved offensive line. And this is just with drafting the guys that the consensus said they should have drafted if they went best player available. And then finally, this past year, Quitty Payne would have been the guy here at 17. He fell a little bit, so they could have drafted him, who I think would be still, I thought Quitty Payne had a good rookie season. Again, this isn't one of those that you're entirely kicking yourself over, but you would certainly rather have him than Leatherwood. And again, if you, had drafted the way that, this says you should have drafted, they probably would, they wouldn't need an offensive lineman anyways, which maybe is, they wouldn't have had that pick to begin with. So this is the final list. Clelin Ferrell, who, not the best. You would have instead had Josh Allen, who has been good for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Again, maybe not elite like we thought he might be, but it's still been a clear upgrade and a solid starting defensive end. Josh Jacobs instead of, Jawan Taylor. Again, that one's kind of, you can make an argument for either side, but getting Jonathan Abram instead of DK Metcalf stings, getting Henry Ruggs instead of Tristan Wirfs stings, Damon Arnett instead of Justin Jefferson obviously stings, and then Alex Leatherwood and over Quitty Payne. All of those, it's like, man, if this team added Quitty Payne, Justin Jefferson, Tristan Wirfs, DK Metcalf, Jawan Taylor, and Josh Allen, and only lost, Alex Leatherwood, Jonathan Abram, Josh Jacobs, and Clelin Ferrell, you'd feel great about that. That would be the best trade of all time if you could pull that off. So what does this tell us? Should you just draft the best player available all the time? Well, maybe. I mean, I do think that's a good strategy to go after just who do you value the highest, and maybe not necessarily best player available. That could be the wrong term because, like, obviously you're going to value a quarterback more than a punter, right? So not exactly best player available. But, taking positional value into account and everything, just drafting the best player on your board might be the smarter move than taking some sort, or really, I should say, drafting the best player on the consensus big board might be the smarter move than trusting yourself. Because again, the Raiders are really smart. The Raiders have a ton of really smart people working this stuff. But the reality is, when you have more brains thinking, you're just going to have better results. That's typically how this works. Not always. Again, the Raiders have done a great job later on in rounds drafting this stuff. But kind of those top picks, I think maybe they overthought it a little bit, which is something I've certainly been guilty of on this channel, of saying, some second rounder is going to be the best player of the draft. That typically doesn't happen, and when it does, typically you're not going to be able to realize it, right? Because if you are the one who's realized it, someone else has probably realized it as well, which is kind of why, well, it's a lot of fun to do that pre-draft. Doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes it does, but not always. So you have to be careful with that stuff. I do think, man, imagine this Raiders team if you added Justin Jefferson, Tristan Wirfs, DK Metcalf, Josh Allen, and Quitty Payne, and Jawan Taylor, and then all you had to get rid of was Cleveland Ferrell, Josh Jacobs, Jonathan Abram, Henry Ruggs and Arnett are already gone, and then Alex Leatherwood. None of the guys are really moving the needle that much. Their most valuable piece that they've got with these picks is a running back, and then the value that they could bring in. This team would be one of the best offenses in football, and they'd still have a decent defense. The defense wouldn't be helped too much in this scenario, but it still would be helped. Add Josh Allen, add Quitty Payne. That makes it better. You don't have to sign Chandler Jones. You can instead spend that money elsewhere. So this would be an awesome team if they didn't, draft these reaches, right? That's Mike Mayock, back when he was working for NFL Network, constantly talked about how I'm simply going to draft who I want. Don't be afraid to take a reach, because if you like the player, then why would you risk losing him? Which to some degree makes some sense. The logic definitely follows. I just think the issue is that it doesn't always work out that way. The issue is that you're typically not smarter than everyone else. Typically, when you think a guy is first round talent and everyone else thinks they're a second round talent, typically you're wrong. And it's hard to think that way. It's hard for me to think that way. I don't think that way. I think that oh no, I know better. And obviously I don't. I've been doing this for a few years. These guys have been doing it for decades. And yet I'll still think that way. So of course they're going to think that way. But the reality is it just doesn't always work out that way. So it's very interesting, but yeah, as a whole, and I didn't even go back. I could have gone back and said, who's the best player they could have gotten, period, right? That could have been even more unfair, I think, to do that. But I thought this was a more fair way to do it. And then still some misses here, still not a perfect draft across the board, even with this, but a lot better. And some luck was involved there as well, right? Of course, okay, Tristan Wirfs happening to fall that far and then being as good as he is, that's luck. DK Metcalf, that's luck to some degree. But Josh Allen, that's not luck. In fact, Josh Allen's probably, you wouldn't trade a fourth overall pick for him now, even though he has been pretty good with Jacksonville. So that's kind of just how that works. But yeah, as a whole, an interesting exercise, I thought, and kind of just goes to show how the trading Khalil Mack wasn't the bad move. And that's why I went back when I did, because I wanted to do the Khalil Mack stuff. Wasn't trading Khalil Mack, it was how they drafted. That's kind of what I think. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.